Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second town hall for future climate leaders as presented by the River Institute. The time is now 6:59 on my clock. We're going to give it about another minute or so for folks to settle in and get together, and then we'll begin this conversation. In advance, thank you very much, all of you that have made it out tonight. Much appreciated, much appreciated. So let's just give ourselves another moment to allow people to settle in. Fantastic. We've got our first hello. I'll take that as a good sign that everybody's where they're supposed to be. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Future Climate Leaders Town Hall for the month of June. My friends, today we've got ourselves a wonderful conversation lined up, but we're just going to start everything the right way. So before we begin, it's important for me to properly and purposely state we begin this event by acknowledging that many of us are living on unceded land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee. We are grateful for the opportunity to live where we do, and we thank all the generations of people who have continued the responsibilities to Mother Earth since time immemorial. With this stated, I invite everyone to take 1 minute to reflect on this country, who we are not, and who do we all want to be. We're going to allow for 1 moment of silence, please. Thank you all for your presence and for your pause. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so my name is Lee Theodore. Who I am is not as important as what I do, and what I do is facilitate a project called Future Climate Leaders. This project is brought to you by the River Institute. It is funded in part by the Government of Canada, and it is made to be a local initiative. Future Climate Leaders is going to use 3 vehicles to achieve its objectives. The objectives, first of all, are awareness, action, and a development of community resiliency. In terms of awareness, we use these monthly town halls to gather people around one common theme and one conversation with a speaker or a series of speakers to help us to engage with a common conversation topic or theme. And from there, we're hoping that conversation leads out from this and people begin to consider other aspects of their lives and are able to have a conversation with common terms and values. The second vehicle that we're going to be using is the website. The website is going to help drive awareness to action. It's in development now as we speak, and it will be available a little bit further down the line, a little closer to August, if we will. But the key thing from there is it's going to be a repository for what's taking place in our community, but also it's going to provide a carbon calculator. With a carbon calculator, folks, you're going to be able to have a sense of accountability. With everything that's going on, it's hard to say what your relationship is with carbon and climate change. And with this carbon calculator, you'll have a number that through actions and behaviors, tips and tricks, things of that nature, you're going to be able to bring that down and have the ability to see what your behavior is in terms of the actual environment itself. The last item will be our workshops. They're in development. The River Institute has a fantastic lineup that it will be available shortly. So look forward to more information on that. Be sure to follow us on Facebook so that we can keep you posted on that information. Now you'll notice that as we work through these town halls, we are currently in our second one. Our third one, keeping in the spirit of having out of this world speakers, we have an additional stellar lineup for you folks at the end of July 30th with Brian Ewenson. Now, to our website, folks, just making sure that we're clear. While I've got you seated, I want to make sure that I put this to your attention because it's very, very rare that we get to all gather in the same place at the same time. The website's going to be very important for this project. It's going to be very important for you. I would like for you to really remember the words carbon calculator. Look for announcements before August. Now, after I introduce our guest speaker, they'll be speaking for an extended period of time, after which we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. We will invite you to include your location in the comments, as we do enjoy knowing where people are coming to us from. Finally, this is what I got dressed up for. I'm in the presence of a particular kind of greatness here. Tonight, we have an individual that is passionate about heritage, history, truth, love, and possesses a realness that is needed and appreciated. Not only is this individual a graduate of Cornell University, but also serves their community within the role of an environment program manager with the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. Ladies and gentlemen, in all things superior, a mighty hello to Abraham Francis. And Abe, before we begin, tell us about you. How did we get to this moment of this town hall, please?
We, I guess, told you all about me. I've been the environment program manager since last August, and I joined the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne in the summer of 2019. So I'm coming up on my second year of being with Mohawk Council. And what brought me here to this partnership is I've been working with the River Institute since I started, and it even goes back even further to Matt Windows and working on the Finns project and my own Minnows project way back in 2015 now. And so in the process of this, I've been really approaching the concept of climate change and the reality that it affects our people. And so I had already received this a project funded by Indigenous Service Canada to address like the holistic health of Haudenosaunee in relationship to climate change. And because of COVID-19, none of my methods were possible to implement. And then I met Lee, and I met this team that is doing this great work through Townhalls and has this great tech team and organizers. And so we started collaborating. And as a part of this discussion, we wanted to have a conversation about what does this look like for Indigenous people in relationship to climate change, and what are the narratives around that? What are the implications? And then let's bring it to Akwesasne, and what can that look like? And how are we approaching those things through, or how am I approaching those things? And how am I approaching with my community to address climate change through the many various mechanisms that are out there? So this is kind of a culmination of those thoughts, and you're kind of at the introduction of what I'm trying to write about climate change and complicating the narrative. So really appreciate the opportunity to present and this team that brought us together. And really appreciate Lee and all the conversations that we've had. So yeah, that's what's brought me here. Lee, you're muted.
Thank goodness for that tech team, eh? So Neowell was what I had stated after that. And Abe, if you want to roll us into this conversation, please just start us off with the title of this town hall, Indigenous Relationships with Climate Change. And from there, my friend, the floor is yours. I thank you for your time.
So I am going to share a presentation with y'all. Now let me get it all set up correctly. So here we go. So I do believe you guys are all seeing the correct screen, right? It says Indigenous Relations, and it's not just my PowerPoint. So what I'm here to do is to talk to you about Indigenous relations and climate change. And even from the inception of the title, I think it's a bit misleading. So I kind of wanted to take a moment to kind of talk about that, because the way that I see the term Indigenous peoples and Indigenous is this global community building term. And it's how we can connect as Indigenous people around the world and find unity and support amongst each other. So it's very like generalized. Now, for my work in particular, I like to bring it right down to the community level. And so I like to talk about being Akwesasne, and what does that mean? And the land-specific relationships that we have, and how our identity is something that's so complex that, and it's so difficult to, I don't know, governments are trying to constantly define what that means. And us as Indigenous people around the world are constantly on the move and refuse to be fixed by these identities and subverted in various ways. And in particular, approaching the concept of climate change. You know, the mainstream climate change narrative tells us that like us as a collective, are all implicated because of climate change, and that we all share this equal responsibility. But I think we're well aware that it's not just the individual consumer that is promoting climate change. Now, I don't say this without the caveat of saying that we as individuals don't have the power to impact climate change, but I'm just saying that there's an accountability in this narrative that needs to be recognized, that the majority of greenhouse gases are caused by, I think it's only a handful of companies, and that they are the ones that need to be held accountable. And so this collective responsibility on a global level is a lie. It's whitewashing and falsehood, and it ignores the systemic violence that colonial governments and organizations have perpetuated against both the land and Indigenous people. But also, one of these great things I heard or was shared with me was like, nobody wins in colonialism. Everybody's hurt by it. And it benefits from this narrative of a deficit model, that we constantly need to be making our hobbies into money-making opportunities, that we need to optimize every single piece of our day or we're not enough. And as one of my mentors shared with me, and you'll see pieces of her all over my work, that you are enough, and that it's important that we recognize that. And for us as Indigenous people, and for First Nations, Native Americans, we have ceremony and we have ways of rejecting that and understanding that we are enough. And I think that in a lot of ways, the narrative, there's been this really strong push to bring Indigenous people's knowledge into the conversation. And I'm going to kind of touch on that a bit more as we move forward, because I think it's kind of hard for us to show up to the table when we've been not even allowed to sit at the table for such a long time. And it's an abusive cycle that we've been engaged in, that we are demanded to perform, and that we're demanded to give our knowledge over, but at what cost? And so I really think about consent-based relationships, and what does that look like for each other, and how can we move forward in a good way? Because we have really important stuff to offer, because we have these relationships that have emerged from these lands and have these layered reciprocal relationships, kinship networks, and intricate knowledge systems that have a data set that goes back thousands of years. And that is valuable as we approach trying to address this complex issue of climate change. And it's kind of hard when you think about those cycles of abuse where our connections and relationships were purposefully destroyed, stolen, and appropriated. And we're sitting here in a time where that's a reality in our face, as unmarked graves are found, and more and more and more trauma is just implicated on our people. And that is a part of this conversation. And it needs to be understood and received in this, that there's patience, and there needs to be patience and kindness and understanding as we move forward, and that we need to negotiate these boundaries in a very careful, pragmatic way. So with that all said, I'm going to go to the next slide. So I've been thinking about climate change for a very long time, and I had an opportunity to work on a project in the past that was called, and it was an architecture project, and it was called to rest the land. And one of the stanza, and interestingly enough, I wrote a poem to go with it, because I'm weird like that and I like to be different. And I find artists and poets just have a way of putting things into words that are so hard to understand. And so that's a really informative part of how I process my research and how I like to tell and speak about my research. This was the third stanza, and the first stanza was about complicating climate change. That climate change is a looming environmental catastrophe of humanity's own creation. We are all responsible. The fallacy maintaining an unequal structure, the land's intergenerational trauma, her children know this pain well. Our land, two-spirit men, women, children, and knowledge stolen, replaced with pain. The insatiable hunger of colonialism cannot continue to feed itself. Let's be sustainable. Another Indigenous concept stolen, diluted, and repackaged by the colonial machine for consumption. Two worlds, the ebb and flow of thought through thought and creativity, diametrically opposed, or an opportunity for building a respectful relationship. Our ancestors did the best and left us the Geswenta. Treaty between two consenting parties, respecting the decisions, defining destinies, the connection to a place, an undecodable language without translator. Through patience, kindness, understanding, and negotiation, we can co-create a future. And to close, in the third stanza was, our ancestors told us the world would end. We watch our mother suffer. She needs to rest to renew herself. Original instructions tell us to acknowledge creation as we are kin. At the intersection of place, community, and knowledge is our identity. Warrior woman said, form is a temporary of expression of energy. Pulsing oscillations cycle through birth, life, renewal, and again life. Survival hinges on reclaiming our reciprocal relations with Yikini. And so what this was all for me speaking about is what I started with about climate change, the narrative just not working. It's not right. It doesn't feel right. It ignores so much, and so much of the ideas about paradigm shifting and sustainability, we already have that. We have Indigenous communities that have been practicing that on these lands for thousands of years. And then I think about partnerships and how can we approach that? And that was like the second thought about this ebb and flow of knowledge. And this third one is kind of this look at the future. And what can that look like? And how can we reclaim those relationships? And how can we move forward in a good way? And it's specific to us as Haudenosaunee. And you see one of my great mentors, Carol Warrior, right there again, in this powerful writing. And the ways that our knowledge is cyclical, is relationship-based, is connection. And that's where I want to be. So in kind of continuing this conversation, I really draw a lot on Indigenous methodologies, and I love Linda Smith. And if you are familiar with Indigenous methodologies, you've probably read her work or read this famous line by her. And this is why I walk forward in a very careful way, because research is one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world vocabulary. When mentioned in many Indigenous contexts, it stirs silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distressful. It is so powerful that Indigenous people even write poetry about research. And so I need people to understand that for outside people, part of this research process, that this can be a violent experience, and that we need to be patient and kind. And one of my favorite things is like, let my people tell their story. Let my people show up. Let us talk amongst each other and figure and analyze. Let's be active participants in this process. We're not subjects, not objects to be studied and for our knowledge to be stolen and mistranslated. And the way that I like to move that conversation forward and think about my partnership building and what is that going to look like is I negotiate that with the Geswenta, and this great teaching that was gifted, that is a part of our, I've always known it. I feel like it's always been a part of our community. And it has. And I've actually seen some different iterations of this, how you can approach research methodologies with this as well. And I really enjoy doing that, because this was a partnership that was created between two mutually consenting parties that respected each other and wanted to move forward in a good way in perpetuity. And so I think about this not just for me negotiating with academics or with the government or anyone. It's for us with other nations. So if I want to work with the Algonquins, then I have to think about moving forward in a respectful way. If I want to work with the Townhall or other communities, I need to respect their land-based knowledge. And how do we negotiate the ways of viewing our worlds back and forth in an ebb and flow? And so that's often where I find myself in thinking about how do I keep this going in a good way with a good mind. Now, let's bring this to Akwesasne. We've talked enough about these like high level, highfalutin ideas. So for those that are familiar with Akwesasne and us as a Mohawk community, we're part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And we're actually the keepers of the Eastern Door. And in Akwesasne, we're the holder of the fire. And it's really interesting to me, and I love, is that like we have this traditional governance system that continues to operate and maintain itself across time. Is it perfect? No, but nothing's perfect. And I think that that's important. But we're part of 6 nations, 6 different nations that share a similar biocultural context with each other and have different similar teachings and relationships with each other. And we tease each other a lot. And the 6 nations are the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Tuscarora, and the Mohawks, or the Ganyankahaga. And so within this context of thinking about our land-based relationships, this was our traditional, this was what our traditional expanse of territory looked like. Apparently. I think as I've come to learn more about the treaties and the history, it's actually way more expansive than that. And I want to spend more time thinking about that expanse and what does that mean? Because again, our cultures emerge from these landscapes and you can see pieces of that reflected in so much of who we are and how we practice and relate to each other and how our knowledge is just even a part of this landscape. But now let's come back to Akwesasne. Akwesasne being this complex jurisdictional nightmare, or as I've heard it described, and as I've described it myself, because I have to work in it. And sometimes it's one of the most frustrating things ever, but it's also an opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity here to complicate these geopolitical boundaries. And like I don't see a border in Akwesasne. I have no respect for a border here in Akwesasne, much like the ecology here. And if we're going to be developing climate strategies and addressing climate change in Akwesasne, how are we going to let these political boundaries determine where we can do activities and how we can best meet the needs of our people? I won't do that, nor will I promote that around the people. So Akwesasne is Akwesasne, and we support and love each other, and we're there for each other. But I guess in general, I am a part of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, which is the governing body in the northern portion that negotiates with Canada. And then I get to work with our sister environmental agency in the southern portion of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribes Environment Division. That is the the governing body in the southern portion that works with the United States. And then across the entire community, we have the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs. And I will bring a little bit more attention to that geopolitical business that operates there. And so there's the symbols for our 3 different governments. And there's even more here. There's so much diversity and complexity here in Akwesasne, which I think has made us resilient and innovative and just so much of who we are. And I appreciate that. Because as much as biodiversity matters in ecology, it matters in thinking, because we need diverse minds to address these complex issues. Now, I need this to be a part of the conversation, because if we're going to address climate change, it needs to meet the context specificity of a community. Because I don't believe in global mechanisms. I think they're just so big that they trip over their own feet and they end up putting things into place that end up just complicating and in a lot of ways make life so much more difficult for Indigenous people. And that was just from my graduate degree and looking at forest stewardship and how, different work by the Forest Stewardship Council or RED Plus kind of complicated things for Indigenous communities. And for me, that was just, y'all didn't do your homework. Indigenous people don't exist in a vacuum. There's so much research out there. There's so much opportunity to talk to these people. What kind of challenges are we confronting? And so a lot of this is just, in my opinion, it sounds like laziness. And so let's understand our communities and what we're developing and how best it can meet the needs of our communities. So within Akwesasne, I've told this story a billion different ways and in different times about the violence we've experienced on this landscape. And the ecological history that we've had to deal with is unfortunate here. We have two areas of concern here in Akwesasne, and I get to work in the intersection of that with wonderful collaborators. But the reality is that our fish were poisoned, and our water was poisoned, and our land was poisoned, and we are dealing with the consequences of that today and the loss of that relationship. And I've used these kinds of understandings and my own research to kind of to approach climate change. And what does that look like in the future? What does the loss look like? And I think that all makes more sense when situated within a biocultural context. So for my community, I like to draw on certain teachings that really speak to our land-based relationships. The Haudenosaunee, the Thanksgiving address, as some may know, is the speech given before important meetings and after important meetings, or before and after important events. And it's this acknowledgement of all of our relations, that we all have a role and responsibility to each other. And these are reciprocal roles and responsibility. No relationship is above each other. We are all equal to each other in this relationship. And so I think that's where one of these really great ways, and there's so many teachings in there, and the way people tell it is so diverse. It's good stuff. And I use it in my entire program that I currently work for and manage is based on Haudenosaunee. Like, I love it. And then I like to bring in the Guyana Lagoa, the Great Law, and speak about Skana, Gossan Staslan, Gatniguhio, peace, power, and a good mind, which Henry Licker shared with me. It's not just about nation-to-nation relationships. It also comes down to people-to-people relationships, and even relationships with self, that we need to have like peace with each other, with ourselves, and there needs to be a good mind moving into those relationships, and a lot of power, because we can't like maintain that peace without. It's an active process of peace. Peace is not the absence of war or conflict. It's an active process of maintaining. And so this is even concept relates to all of our relationships. My relationships with the trees, with the waters, with the plants. It's all a part of that. And how do we maintain that? Because these are beings that have agency within our relational network. They're kin. And then I want to go back to even like what connects us on a deeper level to this landscape, our creation story. And that when Sky Woman fell from Sky World and created North America, there's a story to be told there. That Amber McDonald really looked at the ways that that story aligns with ecological succession. And I'm so grateful for her work and how it, like, I could see it and I could feel it. And that connects us to this place right here. And the clan story, this is a system based on grief that connects us to each other, to support each other during loss. That when someone passes on one side of the house, that it's responsibility of the other to support them and care for them for 10 days. And that this is how we maintain and make sure that we're fulfilling our roles and responsibilities to all our relations. And then lastly, there's the cycle of ceremonies. And in the cycle of ceremonies, it's this annual reminder of when we messed up. And that like we have a ceremony to remind us, I guess really harshly, not to mess up that relationship. And so we have to acknowledge that relationship and be in good relation with it. And so these are the things that I use to think about my work and move forward in a good way and find connection to this place. And I have so much more I could say about this, of where my mind is taking me, but we're here to talk about climate change. And one of the really important concepts to approach, and one of the most frustrating things for me with having a background in microbiology and being trained in the basic sciences, is like, I wanted to control things. I wanted to put them in pretty little boxes. And you can't do that with our knowledge. Like, one of the most frustrating things I would ask people is like, what's important about the forest? And they would say it's all important. And I was so frustrated, because it was like, if it's all important, then nothing's important. Then what do we protect? But when you start unpacking those relational networks and communicating with people, and you start unpacking the stories, you can see this network. And so what came out of that for me was complex connectivity. And one of my committee chair, Dr. Karima Ali Kassam, described it this way: the role of cultural and social processes is conceptually independent but mutually interdependent, yields interesting insights into the complex connectivity that comprise relations with biological foundations. It's a really beautiful way of saying we're really close to the land. And in a lot of ways, we're a part of this landscape. And so this map was the results of my master's thesis, and where I kind of like, you shouldn't be able to read it. If you can, good on you. You got them good eyes. But what I like to bring attention to is like, it's cyclical. These things are connected to each other. That species support our sources of knowledge, which we communicate through story. And that's one of those mechanisms for intergenerational knowledge transfer. And that this complex connectivity, which sometimes is just too out there to even unpack, but that these are all part of this network that sustain our knowledge system in connection to this place, which also will sustain us in a variety of other ways, like for our mental health, for our physical health, emotional and spiritual health. It's all a part of this holistic approach to caring for our communities and across time, drawing on those lessons from the past, living in this present, and looking towards the future. And so part of this, I wanted to kind of delve a little bit deeper into that and think about the complexity of this, because like you can't really read anything on there, but just to bring it that the species on this landscape support stories, and there's practical knowledge associated with those species. And it's through the storytelling narrative process that our knowledge connects us here. And so what we depend on is our knowledge providers. And because of colonialism and violence that we've experienced across times, residential schools, day schools, and just general whiteness as a structure that's kept our people in this position of trying to appeal to it, we don't have as many knowledge holders. But in our communities, and specifically in Akwesasne, we know who our knowledge holders is. We know who we have to go talk to. If we want to talk to them about medicines, we go talk to Eddie Gray. Or if we want to talk to somebody about harvesting, then you call up Vaughn Adams. You want to talk about language, we have so many of those, which is kind of great. It's not every community is blessed in that way. And I'm so grateful that we have so many language holders here. And they're connected to those stories and ultimately part of that web of complex connectivity. And really what I'd want to draw attention to is that the loss of species. What does that actually mean in relationship to climate change? Because one of the biggest things that we're facing with climate change is the loss of species. We're seeing a mass extinction. And in particular, this draws me to this moment to think about basket making, because it's important to my family. My grandmother was a basket maker. Her sister was a basket maker. And I don't think we have any basket makers in our family anymore. But also we're dealing with the consequences of emerald ash borer, and that we may not be able to make baskets anymore. And if that species is no longer here, then what does that mean to us as a community that has made fancy baskets to survive? It's been a means of survival for us for so long. And there's so much pride in that. And there's lessons in that. And I really worry about what that means. And I'm trying to plan on how do we best address this? Do we protect the knowledge and then hope for a day that it can come back? I don't know. We're going to get there as a community when we can actually be in community after COVID-19 has lifted its grip on us. And there's so many other species that are threatened and endangered. So many of our turtles are pretty much every single one of our turtles are species at risk. And what is that going to mean for us, like if they disappear? Think about those things a lot and what that loss is going to mean and how it's going to affect our stories. Do they just become a dance and a reminder that we messed up? that we should have been fulfilling a role and responsibility to them, that we should have been in good relation. It's kind of one of those ones that's really hard to unpack and think about. How do we address this when it's just so glaring in our face? And at the end of sort of where I see approaching climate change in Akwesasne is a bit of this multi-tiered system and recommendations that I kind of came up with through, or no, I did come up through with my master's thesis work with Haudenosaunee forest stewardship, and specifically connecting Akwesasne voices to forest stewardship. And what does that look like? And how can we do that in the best way? And for me, everything comes down to community. I need to be in community. I need to be with my people. We need to be telling stories. I think about going to the store and running into people and the stories we tell each other and how we try to update each other real quick behind our masks. And I look forward to the day that we can gather and tell stories again and share our teachings. And again, the importance of those species being present for a lot of those stories. Like, we can't tell the Great Law, I think, well, if we don't have the Tree of Peace or the White Pine. Now, I don't see that going anywhere anytime soon, but there could be something that we could be implicated. It's all so uncertain. You know, like maple isn't reacting greatest to climate change, and maple is the leader of all trees for our people and part of our relationships. So loss of maple could be extremely severe for us. And I don't want to imagine what that means for us. So like, I think my work is really about protecting that and fighting for that. Now, again, coming back to our collaborations, I've already mentioned Haudenosaunee and how it informs so much of the work I do, and moving forward in a good way with each other. You know, there is a lot of healing that comes along with that work that is necessary. There's a lot of partnership building. I am not interested in transactional partnerships or relationships. I'm interested in that participatory. I'm interested in the rejection of professionalism. I want to know about you. I want to know what challenges you're facing. I want to feel like we are invested in each other's lives and each other's community. What brought you here to work with my people? And let's address my people's concerns. Whether their concerns are real or imagined, that is not up for me to decide. It is for me to research and find an answer and develop some kind of solution to address it. If that's education or remediation project, or it's putting things in place to protect. And one of the biggest things throughout my research, and I hear it quite often, is like, we are disconnected from the land. And we are not disconnected because we chose to, not all of us, but like, we were subjected to such intense colonial violence. And this is limiting our ability to react to climate change. And so as part of this, I'm looking to do curriculum development. And as a part of that is, I'm hoping to communicate to my community members, to Akwesasne, the message that trees are more than trees. They're not a resource, not just a resource, they're a family member. And when you start seeing trees and plants and medicines and creation as more than just a resource to be harvested, it'll change the way you relate and engage with it. And so instead of building that garage, maybe you'll think twice. You'll think about that relationship and what that maintains. What does that tree mean to the local ecology? And removing it, what does that mean? So that's where I find myself obsessed in thinking about these processes and how can we address climate change together. Now, this last one, creating legislation, it's a whole thing. I don't know how I feel about it, like laws and policies and stuff. Like, I do it because I have to, but I know it's a current mechanism that we can use, and why not use it while we can? And I don't believe in the punitive system. I believe in communicating those teachings and those values so we treat the land differently, that we support each other and we're there for each other, and all of creation, that we learn how to be in better relationship with all of each other and all of creation. And we have different measures that are already in place to address those situations. Like, I don't want to see anybody in jail. I don't believe in the police. But it is a mechanism we have available. We still live in the current reality, and this affecting legislation and creating our own legislation is a means of asserting our sovereignty, but also harm reduction. So we are going to use every tool available at our fingertips to address these problems and these issues. And let's do that. So what does the water having agency look like in legislation? And how do we communicate that? And how does it make sense here in Akwesasne? How do we advocate for water in a way that makes sense to us as Akwesasne? Because I'm never going to find my justice in the Western system. It's shown me time and time again that it's not here to serve justice, even to its own people. So I'm going to engage with it to a point that makes sense to me and I'm comfortable with. And I'll reject it when it hurts me. So this is a part of a process for me. And the last little bit, and this is, if you've been to any of my presentations, this is one of my favorite things, is engaging hope. There is hope out there. I don't see climate change as the end. There's special teachings out there that the world is coming to an end, but like, I don't see it like I see it as like a new beginning, that there's something changing, that we're dealing with the consequence of capitalism's insatiable hunger, and that it's going to ultimately consume itself, and there's going to be nothing on the other side of that. But if we could reclaim our relationships, we learn how to plant use our medicines, plant gardens, and care for our relations, I believe that there's an opportunity to shift with climate change in a positive way. And that's where I see engaging hope. But also for our people that, like, we've been through so much over these years, for hundreds of years, and in our engagements and this violent experience, and we lost a lot. But I don't think this knowledge has been lost. I think this knowledge can be called home. And that, very much like Carrie Hill did in restoring this basket, we can restore our basket of knowledge. And I really love going back to this, that it's all going to come back. We just have to call it home. And we're living in this beautiful time right now of resurgence in our communities. And I absolutely look forward to what that is going to look like for my people. I've already seen the impacts of it. I experienced it. I am grounded and supported, and so much of who I am because I've been able to call back so many pieces of myself and explore my queerness in relationship to the environment and find place in my community. And I'm grateful for that, because it wouldn't have been possible in that far of a memory. Now, also within sort of this climate change discussion, I think that there's discussion to be had about healing relationships. And across Canada, we'll hear all about reconciliation, which I am really on the fence about. I think I talk about reconciliation because it's part of my relationship with Canada, but I don't think I fully believe in it. I think I'm more with the youth that say reconciliation is dead, because the reconciliation means nothing to me unless there's action and that there's healing happening. And this healing isn't just between Canadians and First Nations, it's with the land too. We have to heal all of those relations. And I've been blessed to be a part of so many great partnerships, and through one of those partnerships we planted a healing garden, or this healing place, and we created this place that's shared between the Algonquins and the Haudenosaunee and shares our similar knowledges, and we negotiated that. We created this beautiful garden, and I'm so appreciative of that. But also we need to be looking towards the future. And I got to work with a great team of people that went down to Buffalo and are part of this great research project with Outstep. Dr. Michael Twist and Dr. Sharon Moran helped me in this process of thinking about the future and water security. Talking water And it really, for me, was thinking about, well, what does water security look like in the future? And planning for that. And how do we manage the relationships that are going to come out of that when climate refugees start coming north? Because that's what models are showing us, is the possibility. So let's prepare for that possibility and be proactive. Use our teachings to avoid xenophobia, racism, homophobia, all the phobias, all the isms. Let's create a safe space for people to be and support each other and be in good relations, but also protect our rights and our connection here for our communities, because Indigenous people are not always are historically tend to lose out on those. When there's something that is wanted that we have, it gets taken away from us. So let's put things in place to protect that. And this is a part of that conversation. And so what I see as a part of this discussion about climate change in the future is, specifically in Akwesasne, is developing our own thing, or our ways. How are we going to do this? And I see this really great way of conceptualizing sustainability from our point of view. And it all comes down to relationships. And if you want to talk about resilience, talk to us, Indigenous people. We've been subjected to so much, but you know what? We still find happiness, and we are adapting to the changing circumstances that are presented to us. We're adjusting and shifting. Our teachings are changing to the current circumstances that we live in. And that's why I love telling the story about Mary Thibault, this woman that sustained and supported her family with basket making, that rejected the imposition or tried to fixing of her identity in the community, because she was jailed twice for refusing to give up her Canadian citizenship. And she's just, I'm not Canadian, I'm not American, I'm Mohawk. And I just love this picture of her and the joy in her face, because we are a happy people. We laugh, mouths wide open, and I love that about us. That despite what we've been through, that there's joy in our lives. And I have so much more to say about climate change, and we could sit here all day and talk about these complex models that I'm hoping to build, and the River Report, and how Dr. Lee McGoffey has inspired me to think about collective capacity, and think about these cool models and how we can sort of create a model that addresses the ecosystem health around here that is specific to us as Haudenosaunee, as Akwesasne, and that we can see our environment from our point of view. So there is just so much. And so with that all said, I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about climate change and talk about being my unapologetic self in my research, in my work. And I guess it's time to ask questions.
Okay, amazing. So before I open it up to the floor, the greatest pain point of wisdom here that I'm understanding is the connection between what extinction means and what your existence means, not only to like a biological entity, plant or animal, but to the intertwined connection of what that entity means to your Indigenous culture and mine too, your family heritage, language, and identity. Before we get to the audience asking questions, I always try to leave the audience with one thing to think about, one thing to consider. In this conversation, Abe, what would you like us to know, understand, or consider?
So I guess there's two pieces of this, right? One's for the Indigenous kin that are on this call. Reclaim your culture, reclaim your language, reclaim those reciprocal relationships with land and all of your relations. It's there that I think there's a knowledge to live healthier, happier lives, because healing the land is healing ourselves. For our non-Indigenous community that is on this call, support the Indigenous people, acknowledge the land you're on, help us in our efforts to fight against these systems, be accomplices. And that's what I have to give. It's not comfortable work. It's hard work, but that's kind of like the two-tiered way I look at it. So thank you.
Thank you, Abe. Like genuinely, thank you very, 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 very much. At this point, I'd like to open up the floor to our audience for questions and comments. Also, please note that this conversation doesn't have to stop here. I urge you and I challenge you to send your questions in and keep the conversation going well after this town hall is done. There is a slide at the end with my email address for contact, so please reach out. At this point in time, I'm going to now begin asking questions from the audience. I have one lined up out of our Zoom side, and I'll be checking in onto our Facebook side in a moment. So allow my fingers to do some scrolling. We have a question from Jacqueline Milner. She's local to us here, my friend. There are many people who cannot or do not look at water, trees, wildlife as family, as entities that deserve our respect and care. How can we inspire those people to care?
Oof. That's a hard one. That's a real hard one. And I guess the only way that I can think about it is just do your best. Share the knowledge with them. It really depends on who I'm communicating with, where they're coming from, who their family, who are you, and why don't you care? And what is it that makes you not care? Like really building a relationship with someone to understand why it is that they don't care, and then trying to help them care. That's hard work, and that's not for everybody. And for some people, I'm not interested in making them care. I'm more interested in getting my people to care and to reclaim those pieces of themselves that were stolen from us. So it's might have needed a little bit more context on what community I'm engaging with when I'm thinking about that. But yeah, you can only do the best you can, because some people are just not going to, but
so I appreciate the answer. Do the best I can with what you got. I've got another question for you from John Towndrill, another one local to us here. I'm curious about the healing garden you mentioned. Can you say a bit more about it, and where is it?
So it's actually in Shanley, Ontario. It was planted last September. It was produced out of this partnership with a variety of different partners, which were some of them were in there. South Nation Conservation Authority, OPG, First Nations, the Ojibwe of Shabbat, and then the Algonquins of, I'm forgetting, I have it right here. Anyways, this was a long partnership, the Algonquins of Pikwaknagan. And this just kind of came out of this long discussion amongst each other about, it came out of this idea of truth and reconciliation tree planting. And we just talked. We talked and we talked and we talked and we talked about the frustrations. We talked about the needing for stories, a place, a ceremony, a specific trees to be planted in that area to promote the education. That we couldn't just plant trees, that we needed to do more than that. We needed to tell stories. We needed to engage with each other. We needed to be constantly polishing our relationship with each other. Otherwise, it didn't do anything. It was just another tree planting event that just could be easily forgotten. And this idea is continuing to grow across Ontario and Canada in a weird way. And I'm hopeful, because I'm really trying to communicate that aspect that these trees are more to us, that I can teach you a really fun story about cedar. And it is a good medicine, about why ash trees are important to me and how there's 4 different kinds. And I can teach you about the Great Law when I look at the pine trees. And there's even more trees out there. And the tamarack, and there's so many good ones, okay? And it just kind of creates this different opportunity to create a relationship with that landscape, but also for Indigenous people to find a place to do ceremony when ceremony may not be available to them in that area. So hopefully there's this opportunity to create a network of them across Ontario and hopefully Canada. We'll see what that looks like for us, but I'm excited.
Thank you for that response, Abe. Thank you for that question, John. I have another question for you, Abe. Can you give us recommendations for a summer reading list from Margaret Jacobs?
Geez, you always gotta hit me with a summer reading list, huh? I have a lot. And
Okay.
it depends on what you're looking for.
So give me top three or submit one to me and we'll put it up on the Future Climate Leaders page.
So one of my favorites is As We Have Always Done by Leanne Simpson. Just this really unapologetic expression of Anishinaabic intelligence. Love her work, and this just rejection of not appealing to Western institutions to justify her knowledge and our people's knowledge. Like, we don't have to kowtow to these institutions for our stuff to be applicable and important. One of my favorites is Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings by Joy Harjo. There's a poem in there about methodology and theory and dancing with theory, and I love that. And I love how, just love poetry and how poets just seem to describe landscapes in a way that science does really boringly. And then one more that I feel like is meaning a lot to me right now, actually, Love After the End, Two-Spirit Indigiqueer anthology of speculative fiction is meaning a lot to me, because it
Are
really...
you talking about that tomorrow night?
I actually am. Because this book is just about like seeing your queer self in the future. And specifically it's about like a post-apocalyptic future. And I think that's really cool because like you don't really see queer people in like the post-apocalyptic world, like somehow we all died. And so like I think that that's really cool, and it really looks at relationships to land and being two-spirit, being indigiqueer, and what is that, how does that manifest itself? And you see the land, you see the relationships, you see the stories. And I really just think that like the Indigenous queer community of Canada of authors are just out there crushing the game, and I love them. And then there's academic stuff like Jim Ransom's paper about the two-row. There's other stuff out there about Indigenous methodologies. If you want to get into that dimension of it, that's not for everybody, but for my academics out there, there's Indigenous methodologies by Margaret Kovac. There's Research is Ceremony by Sean Wilson. There's Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith. And there's even more and more that just keep coming out and I need to read. And then there's just this beautiful collection of research out there about Akwesasne and so much more. Like, I really need to put reading lists together, even for myself. I'll get there someday.
Okay, so here's what's going to happen. As soon as this video is done, I'm going to have to sit back, rewind to the fast forward to this part, start sitting down, writing these things out and getting it out there. But whenever you do get around to making a reading list, there's actually a good audience that you can't see right now that is genuinely interested in this. So I would welcome that information when you have it. I'm going to relay a message to you from somebody from the audience, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the pronunciation, but my heart is in the attempt, so I'm going to do it. This is from an individual. Thank you. I'm watching from the territory of the Anishinaabe on the shores of Gitchigumi, Lake Superior in the urban community of Thunder Bay. I'm 64 years young, a student completing a Master of Education program specializing in environmental and sustainability education, and a member of Fossil Free Lakehead. Miigwech for your words and sharing. Cool. My friend, so we were 2 minutes to. I still feel like I'm percolating. I'm just going to do another survey of the information. I've got 3 questions in the questions and answer section. To my technical octopus hands in the background, if you guys can copy and paste that into the Zoom chat, because for some reason, as I'm trying to scroll through things, it's either not refreshing or I'm not seeing the information, and I'm trying my best not to miss out. I see the Q&A, my friends. Here we go. 3 questions, Abe. You've expressed and explained this so beautifully and powerfully in English. How connected to traditional language is your understanding / explanation of your relations with the earth and climate change? Would there have been any differences in your messaging had it been presented in the language of your people? Boom.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. I think I love our language. I love our language so much. My mom is fluent and she teaches me language all the time. I try to use the language as much as possible in all my writing. I prioritize it over the English words in every way. When I talk about the St. Lawrence, Instead, I use Kanyak Dalawanene. And maybe even that's not the right one. Like there's different names for the waters out there in different areas. Like particularly my obsession with the language is it's a verb-based language. So it's about action. And as an ecologist, so much of what we're looking at is change, and we're looking at relationships. And that's what a lot of language is speaking to, that relationship in action. Like the word, like I can't remember the name for the tree, and this is why I said tamarack, not just random, is because the word that describes it in Mohawk is, it's something about it sheds its hair falls out or something like that. And I think that's so cool that the language communicates that. And there's so many different ways that the language does that. And I want to learn about it deeper so I can explain things better and I can relate. But like also I don't want to like academicize like all of the language. Like I think the language is hilarious and it needs to remain hilarious. But also some of our relationships and our connections out there can only be described in the language. So it's a part of us, and in order for the language to continue, it needs to be practiced. It needs to be practiced on the land.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like because of our inability to fish, there's certain pieces of our language that we lost. There used to be a name for a knot in a net, and that word's gone. And I'm gonna hopefully get there someday. Like, I mean, I'm just real grateful for my mom that she teaches me Mohawk randomly, and it's hilarious. A lot of yeah, I'll leave it there. It's just really hilarious.
Shout out to the moms out there. All respects due. I have another question for you. For myself, this is coming from Caleb Roach, a non-Indigenous person who wants nothing more than to preserve and respect our environment. Do you have any local organizations that would be a good start to turn my will into action? Volunteering, community work, etc.
Well, you're in great company. Connect with Lee and the River Institute. I think that like that's a really great one because we have such a great partnership with them. Because right now I don't have that fully developed for like my program, is that engagement opportunity for the environment. And the volunteer organizing and the community engagement, that's labor intensive work. It takes a lot of planning, and I'm very aware of that. So we don't have that fully developed. And so that's where I get to take advantage. I get to use my relationship with the River Institute to draw on that, and and focus more on Akwesasne and kind of do things collaboratively, because that's my main focus is Akwesasneans.
All right, so I have another question or comment, or things are disappearing. Okay, they're disappearing. That's good. Thanks for the octopus arms in the back end, guys. I have this point from Marina. Writes, beautiful talk. Thank you, Abe. What role do you think the progression of data and computer science has in helping decolonize climate change research?
Say that one more time.
I shall.
There was a question
beautiful talk. Thank you, Abe. What role do you think the progression of data and computer science has in helping decolonize climate change research?
I mean, I think you're asking an amazing question. And in particular, like when I wasn't listening to Lee was because I was trying to find that question, because I like was really interested in actually answer that. I am not in the position actually to answer that, but let me like go for it. But like computer science, as far as I understand it, can help us in the analysis of data and complex data on the ecosystem. And for me, from like, a data science perspective, I'm really thinking about the models that we're going to build, the statistical analysis that we're going to implement, and how can we get community voices that adjust those underlying assumptions that we make in our analyses. And in particular, I'm looking at Bayesian analysis and using traditional ecological knowledge as a Bayesian prior to improve our models, because we have such a history and a long history, but it's also this complex part of like, well, how do we transform stories and into data? What is acceptable? And that's not up to like just the data scientists to do. I think it's also there always has to be a community aspect of it, a relationship built. Now, also, let's remember too, like, we have to be careful with this data. We have to like respect the boundaries, and that data sovereignty is an important part of this discussion, and we need to have that as along the journey. And how that's going to look, it often just comes back down to prior informed consent, being respectful. That like not all knowledge is accessible. We have boundaries. We're not going to share everything. As Akwesasne, there's bits of knowledge across our community that I don't have access to either because I don't belong to it. But like being able to access and know everything is such a like Western colonial concept. And so like I know I went from computer science to this place about like sort of the, I guess, the ethics around it, but you know, like this is a part of, it's all connected to each other. So I love the data scientists. I love the computer scientists because they're going to be able to they're going to be able to like analyze all this complex data and come up with like the equations and all that good stuff that like, I feel like it's just like this jumbled mess that doesn't make any sense.
Abe, so I believe we've come to the end. Within my position of the project coordinator for this project, I'm a harlot. You can go look up the synonymous word for that, for small business and all things local. In themes with our conversation, I just want to remind people, okay, shop local, shop Indigenous, and take care of your community. Other than that, my tentacles in the back end. You may switch to the last slide. Abraham Francis, on behalf of the River Institute, myself, and those that are in the audience and those that are in the future audience, I thank you very kindly for your presence. I thank you for allowing me into your space to share this, and I look forward to our next intersection on this journey. For those of you that are at home, thank you very much for making this a successful talk, a heartfelt talk. Thank you for your ears and your heart. We invite you to come back next month, July 30th, for our next talk. Please do. And in between now and then, we're asking you locally, especially if you're in the Eastern Ontario area, to turn your ears and your hearts in the direction of future climate leaders. Be receptive to new information. The most important thing that I can close and tell you guys is 2030 is a benchmark time. We need to ensure that we reduce our increasing temperature, ensure that it doesn't rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'll have more conversation about that, but that's the most important thing that I can tell you, that in 9 years, 2 Olympic cycles, we're going to be at a threshold of no return. So keep these conversations in mind, talk to your neighbors, question your purchases, and I thank you very much for being here today. If you have any questions, the information's up. Other than that, we'll see you soon. Abe, my friend, till next time, which will be soon. Love and respect, my friend, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Ona.
Ona. Peace, everybody.